Pro-Palestine protests continue unabated at Columbia University ahead of the start of the Jewish holiday, Passover. The school's president, Manoush Shafiq, announced early Monday that classes will be virtual as reports of anti-Semitic and offensive statements and actions on and near the campus escalate, with many Jewish students reporting that they feel unsafe, according to reports. Demonstrators yelled at pro-Israel passerbyers. One protester repeatedly chanted, "We are Hamas," outside the university, but near the gates of Columbia, protesters chanted, "Hamas, we love you. We support your rockets, too." Now, Shafiq's decision follows growing calls for the university to increase protection. Columbia's rabbi took it one step further, urging students to go home as the campus teeters on the verge of a full-blown crisis. Writing for the Free Press, one Columbia student, Jonathan Lederer, says that he was standing in the middle of campus, waving Israeli and American flags and singing peace songs with other Jewish students when protesters threw water in his face, and one protester held a sign that said Al-Qassam's next targets with an arrow pointing toward the Jewish students. Al-Qassam is the military branch of Hamas.
Pro-Palestinian voices point out that the overwhelming majority of protesters are peaceful and, in fact, are interfaith, with pro-Palestine Jewish students performing Shabbat prayers on Friday night at the encampment. Writer-in-chief of Jewish Currents, a progressive Jewish outlet, has been critical of how most mainstream news actors have covered the protest. And, in fact, she boosted NBC correspondent Antonia Hilton's on-the-ground reporting, during which Hilton says she, quote, "I didn't see a single instance of violence or aggression on the lawn or at the student encampment." She went on to say, "The only moments of conflict or aggression I witnessed took place beyond the gates, out on Broadway Ave. I repeatedly approached people in that crowd. Every single person I approached told me they were not a Columbia or Barnard student. None of them had badges to get on campus." Notably, condemnatory statements from the White House and Zionist representatives like John Fetterman do not cite specific instances of anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, over 100 students from Columbia and Barnard College in New York City got arrested for partaking in free speech demonstrations that took off last week, and they're now facing steep consequences for participating. Per the New York Times, Columbia said that the students' IDs would soon stop working, and some of them would be suspended for taking part in political activism. Monday morning, pro-Palestine demonstrations broke out at Yale University, with Yale Daily News reporting police clad in riot gear blocked off entrances to the campus and has already warned students of potential arrests. Joe Biden issued a White House statement condemning what he described as blatantly anti-Semitic protests by the student activists, making him the first president since Nixon to condemn student protesters.
Yes, a lot going on the campus. I have a feeling we're going to argue about this, but obviously I support free speech, and the student protesters have every right to express their views, to engage in activism on the campus, and that's fine. And I don't think the police should be summoned to arrest them or break them up for that reason. I feel differently about the semi-permanent tent encampment things they, that they've set up. Those, I think, have to eventually be cleared away so that people can go to class and have the normal functioning of the university take place. That should be the priority. But I have no problem with people, even people I totally disagree with, making their voices heard. And I do think a lot of the most contemptible statements, we support Hamas, we love rockets being fired, all of that, seems to be coming from professional activists rather than the students, people outside the university.
Professional activists or false flags, they're unidentified strangers.
False flags.
They're unidentified strangers.
You think it's Trump supporters?
No. Why is a false flag a Trump supporter? It's someone who is wanting to make the protest look bad, whatever their political background. Why are you going to Trump supporters?
Okay, so you think it would...
Wait, why do you think they're
Israeli?
Activists? I'm saying that we don't know who these people are. You were very comfortable labeling them as activists, pro-Palestinian activists, when we have no idea who these people are. That's the point I'm trying to make. And in fact, nobody has connected a single Columbia student with any of the vile statements of actual anti-Semitism that have been recorded and actually demonstrated. And instead of focusing on what the Columbia students have been doing, which is to immediately condemn those statements and to focus on how many Jewish Columbia students are being negatively affected by this, rounded up and arrested, yes, in the lead up to Passover, Jewish students who are overrepresented in these crowds, there is a emphasis from the White House in a way that we haven't seen since Nixon and the anti-Vietnam protests. A condemnation, what he described as blatantly anti-Semitic actions, none of which anybody can point to or connect to a Columbia student.
Well, there was video of, this was on the campus in the tented area of, I don't know if it was, I think it was last night, of the pro-Palestinian activists surrounding pro-Israel students who had come into their midst, forming a human chain. They're chanting, "We must form a human chain. We must eject them from this area." The pro-Israel students have a right to do counter-protesting as well. So if that was Columbia students, that's an action they're not allowed to take. That was on the campus. That was not on
Robby,
Broadway or wherever it was.
I don't know what you're referring to, but pro-Israel
it's all over the social media, so
students
you can
have
probably
been
find it.
protesting this entire time. In fact, pursuing and chasing pro-Palestine students around the lawn as they've been engaged in peaceful sit-ins and interfaith prayer, because so many of the pro-Palestinian activists are in fact Jewish themselves. When you're describing, I'm going to be really clear here, there are Jewish students on both sides of this, overwhelmingly on the pro-Palestinian side on this, and pro-Zionist students, some of whom are Jewish and some of whom aren't. There's been some really important reporting over the last few days about how the overwhelming majority of people in an American Zionist movement are in fact Christian Zionists, who for their own religious reasons, they think that Christ is going to return and Jewish people have to be in Israel so they can be either converted to Christianity or smitten.
I mean, you just said we didn't know any of the the people shouting pro-Hamas on the streets. We don't know their identities. I don't know. If there are pro-Israel students engaging in bad activities, maybe those are false flag people as well. If we're just wildly speculating about the motivations of people out there.
When people are in the lawn, I do think that there's a better presumption that they are in fact Columbia students. Interestingly,
okay, including the person holding the sign that said, "You should be the next target of Hamas." I mean, that was on Columbia property, yeah.
Yeah, well, what's been really clear, though, is repeatedly, the Columbia students condemn any statement that is outside of their goals and objectives. But what we're seeing in the United States of America was that the real power is that we have a Supreme Court that just held, that just decided to not take up a case in which they could have overturned a lower court decision, which held that the organizer of a protest is responsible for what any person at a protest does. And now we're seeing a media class, frankly, a very pro-Israel biased media class, emphasizing what any rogue actor does to try to delegitimize a movement, and a move that in some states could prove to make it illegal, a jailable offense for the organizers of the protest just because somebody else came up and participated. So I think in that environment, it is incumbent on us to be very serious and to really scrutinize who is doing what in these instances, especially when the mere provocation of people outside the gates can draw a president of the United States of America who's ostensibly a progressive, who is an anti-war person who's supposed to be representing the interests of these young people, to do what no president has done since Nixon and the Vietnam War protests, which is to come out and label all of these people as blatantly anti-Semitic in their protest.
Well, people on the right are very used to the mainstream media doing that to them, going to Trump rallies or whatever it is, finding the one person with a QAnon sign or a Nazi sign or something and saying, "Look at how extreme."
So do you think it's right then that they do that?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, then
I'm not broadly characterizing the protest that way. As I said, I think most of the bad activity going on is from outside interloper type people.
But the problem is that Biden is, the mainstream news media is, Jake Tapper is, and that's the problem, because there's a real asymmetry here where there's more focus on what college students on campus are saying instead of the fact that they're protesting that multiple mass graves were discovered over the weekend, filled with Palestinian bodies, that a Palestinian child had to be recovered from her mother's womb as she died as a consequence of an Israeli airstrike. Multiple senior officials in the Israeli government and the American government has said that Gaza should be a parking lot, that it should be obliterated, that there are no innocent civilians. And nobody in our government is censored for those kinds of statements, even though our Muslim representatives are censored for simply saying that from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free from oppression. Right. That's the asymmetry we're talking about here.
People are getting upset about.
And police are rounding up and arresting students, including disproportionately overrepresented Jewish students in these protests.
Well, I don't want an increased police presence or mass arresting of students, especially students just engaged in protest have the right to do that. I mean, they have to. Well, they can't I mean, they should face the consequences of just like not going to their classes, right? I mean, I don't think the university should cancel classes for everyone
they have
to accommodate political
It's so bizarre.
demonstration.
That's a really fascinating point. So the university has decided, even though there is no, you mentioned the tents are obstructing people from going to class. I don't know if you've been to Columbia or spent time at Columbia. The tents.
I've been to Columbia.
The giant lawn on which these tents are placed are not obstructing anybody from going to class.
Right, but
and
I don't
the
think you
response
have
from
the right to
students,
permanently occupy or semi-permanently occupy
but that's
a
not.
public
You made
space.
an argument that whether or not you think that people have a right to do that, your argument seemed to be a practical one, that it is impeding the function of the university, which is not the case. And students, frankly, are curious as to why it is that they're being told, now we are going to do remote learning, when many people who were asking for those kind of provisions during COVID because of their sense of safety in those instances.
Well, I thought that was silly too.
Well, that's fine, but now they're doing it. And so it does speak to the university's priorities, whatever you think about COVID and Israel respectively. It does speak to the university's priorities that they're willing to suspend classes and go to remote learning because of the safety concerns of some Jewish students. Again, not all Jewish students. We should not conflate Zionist students with Jewish students. But we're unwilling to do it for the safety and health concerns of the public at large.
I think that's bad. I think the campus needs to be safe for people to attend in person. I think it largely is safe, and it's not safe. They have to deal with that. I would have classes regularly. I would schedule some exams for this time period, and then people can either go back to their classes or they can suffer the consequence for not doing that, and you don't have to involve the police.
Yeah, it is notable, though, that the Columbia's president did call in the police, and over 100 students were arrested. That is a fact. So when we're talking about, are we complaining about something somebody said somewhere? Are we talking about a president of a university calling on the power of their municipality to arrest and jail students who are expressing themselves politically? We're talking about the president of the United States.
They formed a human chain to eject.
Using his pulpit to condemn student protesters. We're talking about the Supreme Court declining to rectify state law that would make someone who planned a protest liable for anything any protester at that event did. This is authoritarianism.
Student protesters.
It's authoritarianism that it's being backed by people who describe themselves as Democrats and liberals.
Student protesters on Columbia, on the campus, formed a human chain to eject pro-Israel students from their midst. Those students have a right to be there as well. That is aggression, and that you can't do that, and that invites a police response.
More Rising right after this.